Welcome, Ivor Davis. How are you
Well,
doing?
thanks for having me on your sensational show.
Oh, thank you for being here. How have you been holding up in the pandemic?
Well, actually, I've been very busy, and that kind of keeps me um, sort of on the move, if you like. I like biking and swimming and staying in mentally good shape and watching good movies and listening to sometimes to good music. And that's it. What about you? You know, you're slightly younger than me, only slightly. What have you been doing to other than launching a podcast?
Listening to music and running. That's what I do basically on
Good,
the off time. Um,
terrific.
so you've had quite a career in the journalism and industry.
I'm still here.
Um, so going back to 1964, this may have been late 63, I'm not very sure. But when did you first hear that you were going to be doing a tour with the Beatles as a journalist?
Well, believe it or not, in August 1964, I got a call from my editor in London, a guy called David English, and he said, um, get on the plane to San Francisco because the boys arrive very shortly and you'll be traveling with them for the next 5 to 6 weeks. And I said, who are the boys? Well, of course, he told me, and I thought, well, I've heard of them. But don't forget, Hudson, sorry to keep impinging on your age, but back in 1964, we didn't have the internet. We couldn't sneeze in on the East Coast, and I would say bless you on the West Coast in 10 seconds. Communication was a little slower. Sounds like I'm talking about medieval times. Anyway, so what I knew about the Beatles was that I'd seen them in February 1964 on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I thought, wow, these guys, they're from Liverpool. They're pretty good. And everybody raved about them. The girls were screaming. Ed Sullivan told the girls to stop screaming. They carried on screaming. So, and then I was impressed because in 1964, 74 million people tuned into that show. So I thought maybe they've got a future. And so off I went to San Francisco, got off the plane, went to the Hilton Hotel where there was a scene of bedlam. There were like 250, 300 girls outside screaming. I fought my way through, went to the hotel, said, I need a room for a couple of nights. They said, we're full up. I said, I'm with the Beatles. I said, of course. And then I went to see a guy called Derek Taylor, who was a brilliant journalist turned Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager's assistant. He was a publicist for the Beatles, and he was the one that introduced me to the boys. And then the rest of the time, it was a crazy ticket to ride for the next 35 days. Great fun. But I will say this, I never realized that 56 years later, you and I would be talking about the Beatles, because who knew they were going to be, rock and roll history icons over
Never knew.
Never knew.
The communication was slow, but at least you could sneeze in public then.
Yes, you could. You could. And people didn't wear masks.
No.
Although they wore masks in Asia, and we used to sit there. It's nothing to do with the Beatles, but in America, they used to sit there and say, what are these people in Asia running around in the streets wearing masks? Ha ha.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So what were your first impressions of John?
Well, my first impression of John was the same as the rest of the boys. I went up to their suite with Derek Taylor, and Derek, as I said, was my in. He was the guy that, paved the way, and he introduced me to all of the Beatles. Now, you've got to realize they just got off the plane from England. They were all a bit jet lagged, and they were watching themselves on color television, arriving at the airport, and they were thrilled because England didn't have color TV, believe it or not. Can you ever believe a day, Hudson, when there wasn't color TV? Because in your lifetime, you don't know it, do you?
All I've known is colored TV.
Yeah, there you go. So where was I? Okay, so what happened was Derek introduced me to John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and they all sort of grunted, and I thought, well, what a warm welcome that is, isn't it? But they were jet lagged and they weren't interested in meeting other people. They just wanted to see themselves arriving in color on television. And so I will say this, that once the journey began, and it was a crazy journey, we all became pals, because in a way I became kind of part of the family, because they could not leave their hotel rooms. They were stuck with me for 5 weeks. I mean, anybody who was stuck with me for 5 weeks would have to become friendly with me, believe me. Maybe it would take you longer, Hudson, but anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
But I mean, yeah, because if they went outside, they would have gotten mobbed with everybody, teenage girls and everybody. But
indeed.
I mean, I can't imagine, like, if he went out in public, like, I can imagine getting in and out of hotels was a nightmare.
That's what happened all the time, because first of all, we would come, they were in limo number 1. I was in limo number 2. We went from airport to airport. We had motorcycle escorts from the airport to the hotel. We never went in the front door. We went in the back entrance, because there were so many girls, mostly girls, screaming around there. And it was crazy. And I know I don't want to jump ahead, but I'll tell you this. When they went back 5 weeks later, John said, we never saw America. It's terrible. We wanted to see America. We never hardly ever got outside of our hotel except to go to a auditorium, go to a press conference, go to the airport. So it was a kind of a rather truncated looking at America. We don't know America, said John. But you were asking me about John.
Yeah.
John was the best of the bunch in this way. He was funny. He was provocative. He loved to needle you. He loved to try and get under your skin. My name is Ivor. He called me Ivan the Terrible. I said, John, it's Ivor. He just blew me off. It was always that. So that was the kind of thing that John liked to do. He was funny, as I say, provocative, and he said outrageous things. And that's the way he was. That was in his genetic makeup. The rest was slightly different, but the same.
So on like the tours, like where was it, like your favorite place, like your favorite auditorium that you guys went? Because I'm guessing you sat in the front row for every show.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we had our seats in the front row of every show, and Brian Epstein, their manager, would give us the playlist. Well, it was ridiculous because they did the same playlist everywhere except in Kansas City, where they opened with the song Kansas City. And you being a young musicologist, you know what that song is. So otherwise it was always boom, 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 boom. It was 12 songs, 13 songs. And I know you've studied this closely, but here's a question for you. Can I ask you a question?
Oh, of course.
How long do you think the Beatles played on their first American tour? How long did they perform for?
30 minutes.
You must have read my book. Yes, you're right. But you're exaggerating a bit. 26 minutes, 27 minutes. sometimes 27 and a half minutes.
If you were
Because
lucky.
it was a running gag. Did we break the record, lads? You know, did we do it 25 minutes and 18 seconds? Boom. But you know, today you can never get away with 30 minutes on stage.
Oh gosh, I mean, when I've heard people that have seen Paul in concert and he plays for 3 or 4 hours straight.
Yeah. Well, I'll just jump ahead and say, before the coronavirus, I went to San Diego to see Paul. And I went backstage before the show and we chatted. And I said to him, well, you used to play for 30 minutes or less. Are you going to play longer, Paul? And he said, wait and see. And he played 3 hours and 15 minutes. He never, did you see a Paul McCartney concert?
No, but I know a lot of people that have.
3 hours and 15 minutes, never leaves the stage.
I swear the guy's an Energizer bunny.
Oh, unbelievable. Energizer bunny, I think that was made in his form. That was Paul. But Ringo does his own show. Have you seen a Ringo show?
No, I've got to see a Beatle.
Well, Ringo and his all-star band do about 1.5 hours to just 2 hours at max. But Ringo is very clever. He was never the best singer in the band. I think he actually played the drums, if my memory. No, anyway, so he goes.
That was Pete Best.
Pete Best. Oh, Pete Best. Well, Pete Best sometimes does a guest appearance. No,
yeah.
I'm only kidding. That's an interesting story. But when you see Ringo perform today, and he loves to go on the road, as Paul does, Ringo leaves the stage, lets the young musicians in the all-star band do their thing, and then comes back on again. So he knows his limitations, but people come to see Ringo, and he knows that.
Yeah. And like, have you how many times have you seen Paul, just out of curiosity?
I've seen Paul a few times after I left, the Beatles ended in 66.
Yeah.
I saw Paul in New York once. I saw him in LA. I saw him when he was married to Linda in Beverly Hills, and that's a long time ago because Paul, as you know, as you follow the music, Paul wrote "Live and Let Die" for the James Bond movie.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, 70s, 80s. I can't remember what year.
73.
73. Okay. And so I went to the Beverly Hills Hotel, and there was Paul there, and he was up for an Oscar, and he said to me, I always remember this. He said, "You know how long it took me to compose Live and Let Die for the movie?" I said, "What, 2 or 3 days?" He said, 10 minutes. He said, "I sat down and did it in 10 minutes. Well, he never won an Oscar, but it was quite a good song. And as you know from the show, he does Live and Let Die on stage. And don't they have fireworks?
Yeah. It's what I've seen on YouTube. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I would just be there staring at not being able to speak. I still don't know how you were able to do your job journalizing.
Well, it was a great fun. I know that I'm on your program for you to ask me questions, but I was fascinated to ask you a question. So
absolutely.
Okay, so here's the thing. How did you suddenly become so immersed in the Beatle thing? Did your mother put Beatles on her tummy, Beatle music on her tummy when you were in the womb? Not the room, the womb.
No, my mother did not know, pun intended.
Yeah. Very good.
So going back to I think I was 8 years old. My grandfather, he was on the show a bunch of episodes back. He gave me a record player, and one of those records was Imagine, John Lennon.
Oh, wow. Yes.
And then a couple of years later, for the 50th anniversary, I bought Sgt. Pepper, and I've never looked back.
Yes. I want to tell you that I have done, since I did my Beatles and Me on Tour book, I got caught up in the in some of the Beatle conventions, and unfortunately, the last year or so, there's been nothing except virtual. And there are people my age, there are their children, and there are their grandchildren coming to the Beatle conventions, who are, it's like being passed on a sort of memory or whatever. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, it's crazy. Um, Going back to John, kind of backtracking a little bit. Julian was born, so was like Cynthia calling him constantly.
Well, one of the great stories was this, and this happened because John would call us in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning. Me, the guy from the Westinghouse, Arthur Schreiber, who was the Westinghouse political correspondent, who I got friendly with because he said to me the first week, I'm a political reporter, and they send me on this bloody trip. What do I want to do? What do I know about rock and roll? Anyway, we're still good friends. Arthur's wonderful. And I want to tell you that you should, I'll tell you about him. I'll send you the link. He's in a retirement community in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Brilliant memory, great storyteller. But so Arthur and I would go to John's room at 2 a.m. to play Monopoly. And just before the game started or halfway through the game, John would call Cynthia. And don't forget, we were 8 hours behind. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, it was 10 o'clock in the morning in Liverpool. And he would get on the phone to Julian, and he would goo, and he played like the kind of daddy noises, transatlantic daddy noises. And in those days, it was expensive to call overseas. So I think John spent a few shillings on phone calls. And then when we get back to Monopoly at 2 or 3 in the morning, and John would cheat badly at Monopoly, but we let him get away with it because I think Arthur and I won some money playing poker. And John lost quite a bit of money, probably over the tour. He lost about $7 or $8. I mean, big money then. But he never paid us his gambling debts. And even today, I send a note to Yoko, and she just ignores my requests for gambling payments. But, what can you do?
It's a Beatle. He can't say no. But wow, I mean, I'm starstruck.
Yeah, it's fun. But we never knew, Hudson, that they would be, legends. And they never knew they would be legends.
No. And going back to Ringo a little bit, in a recent interview, I believe he said that he was he needed touring to help him be all happy, which is really something that I thought was wonderful.
Yeah, to clarify that a little bit, when you say he needed touring to be happy.
Yeah, to be his persona. So yeah, I'm wondering if that is to
well,
just active.
I'll tell you this. Of the four Beatles, Paul, we'll talk about Paul. I mean, he was always always a very personable guy. Ringo was the drummer. Ringo didn't have all that much to say, and neither did George. George was, they called him the quiet one. He just didn't have a great deal to say. So if you don't know what to say, okay. Now, the only time the boys, Ringo and all of them, lit the scenery up was when they had press conferences, because it was like the Four Stooges. Now, the Three Stooges were comedians back in the early 50s, in the 40s. So the Beatles and the Marx Brothers were another bunch of a family of comedians. Anyway, the Beatles were very funny together. They were like, I'm sure you saw A Hard Day's Night.
Oh, yes.
And of course, in A Hard Day's Night, they meet the press, and I think somebody says to George, how did you find America? And George says,
I can't.
George says, you make a left turn at Iceland or something,
Yeah.
that's how you found America. Good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
something
So
like
they were
that.
very funny, very witty, and they could finish each other's jokes. So as a unit, they were hilarious. Individually, John was hilarious, Paul was charming, George was a bit on the quiet side, and Ringo was the drummer. So what do you expect? I mean, Hudson, I know you haven't been around all that long, but do you know a drummer who's a great personality, who is Mr. Quixotic, who is Mr. Personality, Mr. Tell jokes? No, drummers don't tell jokes. I mean, maybe somebody's going to call in
Mick Fleetwood,
when the
maybe.
show airs and say, hey, Hudson, I'm a drummer and I can tell jokes. Get him or her onto your show.
Denny Sewell's pretty funny.
Who is?
Denny Sewell, Wings drummer. He's pretty
Wings
funny.
drummer. Okay, yeah, well, okay. I don't know him. But, having traveled with Paul and Linda, I think he would have to be funny to survive. But anyway, good to hear that.
Yeah. So moving into Paul, what was, like Paul, he's always very charming, very nice guy. And he was with Jane Asher at the time. Was Jane with him on that tour?
No, we all knew that Paul had Jane Asher, the girlfriend, waiting back in London, waiting for Paul to come back. And, maybe it would be a happy ever after story. Look, they were the Beatles, four young men with very healthy libidos, four young men who loved to be in the company of pretty girls or pretty women. So there were pretty women galore. So Paul was a boyfriend of Jane, because as Beatle fans know, Paul actually lived in Jane's parents' home with Peter Asher.
Yeah.
He lived in the attic at the top of the stairs. And so, but they were all, young men. These women wanted to hold their hands and whatever they wanted to hold. And they loved it. And Paul, I remember very well that Paul was going out with a beautiful actress called Peggy Lipton. And Peggy Lipton said to me at a party that the Beatles had, I am going to marry Paul. I remember that. I thought, well, how does she know? Well, as it happened, her prognosis didn't work out because Paul didn't marry her. She married Quincy Jones, the musician. And so there were a lot of girls there. Anyway, getting back to Paul, he was charming from day one. On the private jet that they rented, the Electrojet, which we traveled with the Beatles, with Jackie to Shannon, with whoever, the Righteous Brothers who were on the tour. Paul would come down the aisle and say, can I get you a drink, Ivor? Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll have a gin and tonic. Easy on the tonic. And Paul would come back and serve me a drink, which was wonderful. I never even tipped him. Anyway, so that was the experience. And he was always good-natured, charming. And that charm, it was his calling card. And he's got that charm today because, as I mentioned, going backstage before the show, Paul was wonderful, introduced me to Nancy, his newish wife, or his Jewish wife, newish or Jewish, both. And it was fun. And he just knew how to do it. And when his manager said, Paul, time for the show, Paul said, no, I'm talking to Ivor, very clever, very well, a diplomat. He could have been a good diplomat.
And what year was this? Was this right before the pandemic?
Yes, the pandemic was 2020. This was in November 2019.
Oh, wow.
San Diego Petco Stadium in downtown San Diego. A great show, a terrific show.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, what's your favorite Paul McCartney album? Just off of curiosity.
My favorite Paul McCartney album or song?
Album.
Well, I love some of the stuff. I'm bad on the one. Was it? There's something of McIntyre when he was up in Scotland. He did.
That was
he
just
did
a
that.
single.
That was a single. Okay, so I'm only going to tell you singles. The song I love that he does, of course, is Eleanor Rigby.
Oh,
And also, I love the song he did for Nancy, his wife, which is much later, called My Valentine.
On Kisses on the Bottom. That's a beautiful song.
Yeah, isn't it? So, if you were to say to me, Ivor, what did and say this song, what album was it on? I can't tell you. I know a lot about the Beatles, but I'm very bad on saying, oh, that was, I can say a song to you. I can say to you, here's a test, ready? One of my favorite John Lennon songs, and I'm going to say this with the Beatles, and you're going to correct me. I love Working Class Hero, and you're going to say, Ivor, you're an idiot. Working Class Hero was not a Beatles song.
It was not a Beatles song.
Thank you.
Can
you remind me what that one was?
Working Class Hero on his first solo album on Plastic Ono Band.
Okay. And I must tell you this, Plastic Ono Band, exactly right. Very good. You should be on Jeopardy. He did that song and that album, and I was in LA after he'd undergone primal therapy. Now, I don't know if you know this, but he came to LA to spend time with a guy called Arthur Janov, who was a psychologist. And what happens in primal therapy is that you go into this lab, this nursery, and I went there and I didn't see John doing it, I saw other people doing it. And you are reborn. You become like a baby. And John did it with Yoko. Primal therapy, I forget the year, 70, 69, 70.
Yeah.
And after he emerged from this, he made this Plastic Ono, and it's a very personal one because, again, you can correct me on this. Didn't he have a song called Mother?
Yeah, that was the single leading off the album.
So that emerged. So at least primal therapy wasn't a waste of time. It gave him the visceral stuff, including Working Class Hero, which I love. I love the lyrics, and he kind of. And the other one I like about, and correct me again, or put me on the right path there, Hudson. I love other songs. Let's see, what's the other one that he does now that's great? Working Class Hero. Oh yeah. What about the one he says, I don't believe in Elvis, I don't believe in this, I don't believe in that. What is that song?
God, same album.
God, okay, same album. So that's a great one, isn't it?
Oh, it's
so
top 10 Lennon songs.
Yeah. I like the songs on that one because, again, they came from the heart and they were all about John and Yoko. So there it is.
Yeah. But so I know you've written a book about Charles Manson and the Beatles.
Yes.
I am a little confused on that with the whole Helter Skelter thing. Would you be able to clear it up, please?
Well, here's what happened. In 1964, I covered the Beatles. In 1965, I traveled with them a little bit. And 1966, only when they came to LA. So in 1969, as a reporter for a big London newspaper, I was covering the Sharon Tate murders. Now, Sharon Tate was a beautiful blonde actress, 8 months pregnant, married to the famous French-Polish film director Roman Polanski. He was in London, she was in Beverly Hills, in a canyon house. And one night, August 1969, a bunch of people went up and murdered Sharon Tate and 4 of her friends. Eventually, cops sort of solved the case. And I was on the case. I was following it. When I heard Charles Manson was the ringleader of the killers, I went to a ranch called the Spahn Movie Ranch. And there's a film called Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which was done by Quentin Tarantino, which tells you about that sort of. It's a fairy tale. It's not quite the same a story. So I go as a journalist to this ranch. And some of the Manson members who are not involved in the killings talk to me, and they tell me, and I think they're all bonkers. They're all on LSD. Paul Watkins tells me Charlie every day played the White Album music, and in the White Album music, he told us, and we believed it, that the Beatles were sending the Manson family secret messages about to happen black and white revolution in America, with blood flowing in the streets, and Charlie Manson and his gang, because the Beatles had sent them secret messages in the lyrics on the album, on the White Album, Charlie would be forewarned and would escape to an underground city in the desert. Charlie brainwashed the Beatles followers, the Manson followers, that the Beatles were sending messages. Well, you can imagine, when I heard that story, I thought, this is utter rubbish, a total, somebody's gone crazy. And because I knew the Beatles lyrics, I knew Helter Skelter, I knew the songs, I knew that Helter Skelter was not a song written to go out and tell people to go out and kill each other. I mean, it was ridiculous. Revolution, saying pig is, that was what Manson told his followers. So I thought, this guy is crazy to say that. A year later, July 1970, as a journalist, I sit in a courtroom and the district attorney stands up and says, ladies and gentlemen, the motive for these horrendous murders is that the Beatles' music, according to Charles Manson, inspired him to tell them to go out and kill. And I was flabbergasted, but they used that thesis, that motive, in a year-long trial of Charles Manson and his acolytes, and got a conviction. So go figure.
So moving back to the earlier times, let's talk about the encounter with Elvis. You were the eyewitness to that jam, if I remember correctly.
Yes, well, what happened was in 1964, Colonel Parker, Tom Parker, the manager of Elvis Presley, and Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, got together and wanted to bring their boys together. John desperately wanted to meet Elvis. John grew up, he told me, with Heartbreak Hotel, Blue Suede Shoes. When he was a younger boy, he used to listen to it on a radio, a channel called Radio Luxembourg, which was a European channel, pop music channel. So he wanted to meet them. He wanted to meet Elvis. The other guys wanted to meet Elvis. But in 1964, they were too busy. The Beatles were touring, Elvis was making movies, blah, blah, blah. So in 1965, I got a call. Mal Evans, the road manager of the Beatles, said, we're going to see Elvis tonight. Get over here. So I went over there, and I discovered later on that Brian Epstein had written a note to Colonel Parker saying, well, I'm looking forward to the boys seeing Elvis, but 2 conditions. 1, no press. 2, no tape recorders. 3, no cameras. So I went along because I was able to squeeze in with them. And when we get to Elvis's place, Elvis, or a guy that looks like Elvis, is sitting on the couch in the room, playing with a remote. Again, remotes. Wow, the Beatles were stunned. What is a remote? It changes channels. You click it, and it changes channels. And Elvis has a giant television in the living room, or at least 18 inches big. That
which
was
was
what was
giant
called a
for
giant. Maybe even 24 inches. I never
that
actually
was
measured.
huge for back
Huge,
then.
exactly, huge. And Elvis is flicking channels. The Beatles go in there, and nobody introduces the Beatles to Elvis. I mean, it's ridiculous. Nobody takes it upon themselves to be the diplomat. So for 10 minutes, they sit around looking at Elvis switching channels. It's ridiculous. I'm the fly on the wall. What's going on here? Finally, Elvis, I've got to give it to him. He has a sense of humor, jumps up and says, I thought you guys came here to jam because I'm going to bed. And the Beatles jumped up, and then they brought in the guitars, plugged them in. Poor old Ringo went to play snooker, pool in the next room. There was no drums. And for about 15 minutes, the Beatles, led by Elvis, played mostly Elvis music. And that broke the ice. And then they started talking and chatting and all the rest of it. And of course, in the room was a little girl who came up and was introduced to the Beatles. She looked about 13. She was about 5 foot tall with hair, another 3 feet tall. And that was a lady called Priscilla.
Yeah, Priscilla.
That was his young fiance. Anyway, so after that, they warmed up a bit. They talked about, Paul said to Elvis, Elvis, I wish you would make the kind of songs, record the kind of songs you used to make. Elvis took offense with the suggestion that, what's Paul, this guy, telling me what to sing? But what I didn't realize at the time, Hudson, was that Elvis was jealous of the Beatles because they'd knocked him off the hit parade. Number one, he was king, and these little upstarts from Liverpool had taken over. And also, Elvis was making 3 awful movies a year. 3 movies a year. Elvis in Hawaii, Elvis in New Jersey, all those silly places. So he was jealous of them. And the Beatles made one single movie, A Hard Day's Night, and it's a smash hit. So I didn't realize it at the time, but Elvis was jealous of the Beatles, and that's why he gave them. He wasn't too friendly at first, and the conversation was a bit stilted. But the one thing I remember was that they all loved the movie that had just come out, a movie starring Peter Sellers called Stanley Kubrick movie called How I Loved to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, which was a comedy film made by Stanley Kubrick. Elvis loved the sense of humor. The Beatles loved the sense of humor. They also loved the star of the movie, a guy called Peter Sellers. And Peter Sellers was a great comedian, English actor, who was John and the Beatles' favorite star of the John and the Beatles' favorite show, the Goon radio show in England. So they hit it off. They said they would meet again. Never happened.
So, moving to the Dylan meeting, where they smoked some stuff together, we'll say.
They did.
What was that experience like, witnessing that?
Well, I didn't know about it, but we were all in a hotel by Kennedy Airport. It was called Idlewild Airport at the time, and we were staying at the Idlewild Inn, which was a sort of okay motel, half a mile from the airport. And we were having a farewell party because the Beatles were going home the next day. So I was up there, and I suddenly saw this guy, this scruffy fellow with a stubble beard and a backpack, walk in, and I thought, that looks a lot like Bob Dylan. and it was Bob Dylan, because as soon as so we were on the outside of this suite, and we were eating and having drinks all on Brian Epstein. And when you could have a free drink on Brian Epstein, it was terrific. So we were having drinks, and so Mr. Dylan goes in the shuttered doors. Somebody puts a towel at the foot of the door. I thought, what's going on here? But suddenly inside, there's sort of an odor that some people recognize wafting in from the room with the Beatles and Bob Dylan and Brian Epstein and a couple of the roadies. And finally the door was open and a cloud of smoke enveloped me. And I thought, I wonder what that odd odor is. Because anyway, it was, of course, marijuana. And then I said to Mal, what happened? He said, because Ringo, by the way, was on the floor, in the room, in the suite, rolling on the floor. And I said to Mal, what happened? He said, well, Bob handed Ringo a fat cigarette. And Ringo, not knowing diplomacy, I mean, there is diplomacy apparently when you are smoking marijuana, he smoked the whole cigarette. He never gave it on. He never took a puff and passed it on, which apparently is what you had to do. But there were no written books about it. So Ringo, just smoked the whole thing. And he was giggling. Brian was giggling. And the next morning, we all went to the airport. I think the Beatles were slightly hungover. And we all said goodbye to the Beatles. They jumped on the plane and went back to England. And believe it or not, Mr. Lennon and Mr. Dylan kept in touch, so that a year or so later, Bob went over to London and stayed with John. So they kept the relationship going. They said they loved Bob Dylan's music. They first heard it when they were in Paris. I forget the year, maybe 60, 63, 64. And they always wanted to meet Dylan. And that's their strange encounter with Mr. Bob Zimmerman. Oh, so, Dylan. Sorry. Zimmerman. His name was Zimmerman,
Yeah, big Bob Dylan fan. So,
yeah. How what can I tell you?
So, moving away from the Beatles, you were around when Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. Do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Well, as a foreign correspondent on the West Coast of America, I covered everything, every big story. And as soon as the Beatles went home, I went back to LA, and the next story was covering the Warren Commission report on John Kennedy. So you forget about the Beatles and you concentrate on John Kennedy's Warren Commission report. But in 1968, which was 4 years after I first met the Beatles, I happened to be traveling with Bobby Kennedy, who was the bright hope for the Democrats to become president. And Bobby was a charismatic guy. I traveled with him up and down California. He was very warm. And I remember seeing him when we arrived in LA on the night of the election. His hands were raw because he'd been shaking hands with so many people. And we were at the hotel. We know Bobby has won California. He's won California and he's got all these electoral votes to go on to the Chicago convention. We're going to have a press conference. Bobby says, thank you to the mayor. Let's move on to Chicago. We start to move to the press conference. Somebody takes him for a shortcut through the kitchen, through the pantry. I'm 20, 30 feet behind. Suddenly I hear balloons popping. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then suddenly I hear screaming. I push my way into the pantry of the kitchen, and there's screaming. There is Bobby on the floor, bleeding. Ethel, his wife, is cushioning his head. She screams, give him air. And it's bedlam. And there is Bobby bleeding, dying. It's an image that you never forget. And then hours later, we're at the hospital at 3:00 in the morning. And Mankiewicz, Bobby Kennedy's press guy, says Bobby is dead. But when I think of that picture in the kitchen, I never saw the killer. I did see somebody under a sea of bodies, and that was Sirhan, the guy who murdered Bobby. And it's, as I say, an image that just never disappears. Today, you could never get that close to a presidential candidate, but then you could, and that was the terrible night that Bobby got murdered.
So moving back to the Beatles, before John and George passed, after your meetings, did you keep in touch and see them at all?
About John, I saw John after he went through primal therapy. I went to the house he was renting or borrowing from the record mogul Lou Adler. It was in Bel Air, California, in a posh neighborhood opposite the Bel Air Hotel. And John was trying to get his career back on track. So I went to the house and I knocked at the door to do the interview with John, and we sat at the pool, and a young lady invited me in, and John said, "This is May Pang, my secretary." Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. May Pang. Okay. So we sat around, and I didn't know that Yoko had sent John to California with May Pang as a consort, as a companion. But John talked about what he was doing, how he wanted to resurrect his career. He was charming. We had drinks. He had drinks at the pool. I mean, I was trying to do my job. My photographer, Cyril Maitland, took some great pictures of John at the pool. And John was charming. And that was it, the last time I ever saw John. And then I saw George a few years later before he died. Derek Taylor was very close to George and came to America with, was it Black Label, White Horse Label? They had some label.
Dark Horse.
Record. Dark Horse, okay, I was close. I had the horse right. And John and George came over with Derek, and we hung out together a bit because he was promoting. And then Ringo I saw in concert about 5 years ago. But Ringo, I remember the story. Ringo came to Los Angeles to promote a PBS children's program, something about
Thomas the Tank.
Thomas the Tank, yes, very good. Thomas the Tank, PBS. So I go and have lunch with him, with the publicist from PBS. And we sit down, and the publicist from PBS wants him to talk about Thomas the Tank Engine, or Thomas the Engine Tank. And Ringo, for some reason, decides to tell me that he's been sober for 4 years and 37 days and 3 hours. So we're talking about this kids program. The publicist for PBS television is going, why is he talking about his alcoholism to this guy when we want him to talk about Thomas the Tank? But Ringo said to me that he used to, and I didn't know this, he said he used to never like to go away from his house more than an hour because he so desperately yearned for a drink. He couldn't do it. And so he was so pleased with the fact that he was sober for 4 years and whatever. And in fact, Derek Taylor, the publicist, sent me a book that he wrote. Derek was also an alcoholic. Derek Taylor sent me a book that he wrote in which Ringo writes a foreword. It's sort of anti-drinking and all that stuff. And to this very day, Ringo looks 59. I think he's 80 now.
Yeah.
80, right? 80 last July. And doesn't drink. And Ringo, I saw him on the Colbert Show. I know she's watched the Colbert, Stephen Colbert, he was on. Ringo looks like he's 25 years younger than me. Anyway.
Ringo looks younger than me, and I'm 13. It's crazy.
Okay. Well, yeah, he looks younger. wait a minute, let me, I think that's a slight exaggeration. Younger than you, maybe, but, he works out every day he's a vegetarian. He has a trainer coming to his house in Los Angeles every day. That helps, but he looks terrific, doesn't he? Even younger than you.
Yeah. Well, I think that about concludes our interview. Now I want to turn it over to you. And what would you like to plug?
Well, I just like to plug the fact that it was fun talking to you. You are, without doubt, this is another milestone for the Guinness Book of Records. This is the first time I've been interviewed in such an intelligent, brilliant way by somebody of your generation. So that's congratulations and thank you. I'm doing, funnily enough, on Thursday, a program for middle school kids. Would you believe middle school kids in Ventura County? There's about 5 schools coming together to hear me talk about the Beatles, which is good. So I'm on a youth kick. The only problem is, how can I turn it back so I look like I was when I was 25 traveling with the Beatles? If you know the answer to that, send me in a stamped addressed envelope. Anyway, so thank you. My books, The Beatles and Me on Tour, great fun, terrific fun, great stories. I wrote a book, I must tell you this, a quick children's book called Ladies and Gentlemen, the Penguins. And it's about 4 English penguins from the Falkland Islands who decide they want to become rock stars almost as big as the Beatles. And the great thing about the 4 penguins is their first big hit on the Falkland Islands is I Want to Hold Your Flipper, which is a great song if you have never heard it. And the great success for the Penguins, is when they appear on a show in New York, television show, to great acclaim, called the Ed Pelican Show. So the Penguins are on the Pelican Show. Anyway, and they sing songs like we all grew up in a yellow ecological submarine or something like that. Anyway, so I have fun with that. And the final book is not much fun, but a good read, but the Beatles are in it. It's Manson Exposed, a reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder. And now I'm working on another book, which I'm not going to tell you about, because if I do, you won't have me on your show. So it's not about the Beatles. It's about the greatest showbiz people in Hollywood history that I had fun times with. So with that, thank you for having me, Hudson. See you again.